The galaxy had already been at war for thousands of years before Luke Skywalker was even a thought in the universe, and what happened during that era of the Old Republic is honestly one of the most jaw-dropping, tragically complex, and criminally underappreciated stories in all of Star Wars lore. Before I move forward, I want to be upfront about what this video is and what choices went into making it. I put this together because I felt like most Old Republic coverage either skips huge chunks of the timeline or focuses so heavily on the game storylines that the broader sweep of history gets lost. When assembling this, I made the deliberate choice to lead with the Infinite Empire and work forward chronologically, rather than jumping between factions or starting with the Sith. I also chose to lean into the political and civilizational side of things, not just the battles, because I think that context is what makes the battles actually mean something. Some of the in-game text, codex entries, and supplemental lore I pulled from suggests slightly different readings of certain events. And where that happens, I'll flag it. This is an interpretation, not a definitive canon playbook. All right. Let's go back to the very beginning. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1: The Infinite Empire and the Dawn of Galactic Civilization. Long before the Republic existed, before the Jedi were an order, before any of the factions we recognize had taken shape, there was the Rakata. The Rakata built the Infinite Empire, and for a very long time, the Infinite Empire was the most powerful civilization the galaxy had ever seen. They did not achieve this through diplomacy or through some noble vision of shared prosperity. They achieved it through conquest, through slavery, and through a mastery of the Force that was unlike anything that would come after them. The Rakata were Force-sensitive as a species, and they channeled that sensitivity into a form of technology that could only function through a connection to the dark side. Their hyperdrives worked through the Force, their weapons worked through the Force. Their entire civilization was built on a kind of dark side engineering that modern science in the Star Wars universe has never truly replicated. This is one of those details that the lore suggests is foundational to understanding everything that follows. The Rakata built the Star Forge, a massive space station that orbited a star and used both solar energy and force energy to manufacture ships and weapons at a staggering rate. The Star Forge is important. We'll be coming back to it. At its height, the Infinite Empire stretched across hundreds of worlds. The Rakata enslaved species from dozens of planets, using force-imbued technology to dominate populations that had no means of resisting. Among the species they enslaved were the ancestors of the humans, who would later found the Republic. The lore points toward a relationship between the Rakata and early human civilization that shaped the genetic and cultural memory of humanity in ways that are almost impossible to fully trace. What we do know is that the Rakata were brutal overseers who left deep scars on every world they touched. One of those worlds was Leon, or Rakata Prime, the home world of the Infinite Empire. Leon sat at the center of the Rakata, directed their empire across the galaxy. The planet itself was a tropical world, ancient and humid, covered in ruins by the time any outside archaeologist would come to study it. The ruins on Leon are among the oldest structures in the galaxy, and the lore suggests that studying them was one of the key ways that later civilizations pieced together what the Rakata had actually been. For thousands of years, the Infinite Empire seemed invincible. The Rakata had no serious rivals. They had the Star Forge, they had force-imbued weapons that could devastate entire fleets. They had the hyperspace lanes they had mapped themselves, routes that other species would not discover independently for centuries. And then something happened that the Rakata did not see coming, something that their entire civilization was not built to survive. A plague broke out. The plague that struck the Rakata was not an ordinary disease. It was a sickness that attacked them specifically, that spread through their population with terrifying speed, and that had a secondary effect that was perhaps even more devastating than the physical illness itself. The plague severed the Rakata from the Force. This is one of those moments in the lore where you have to stop and let the implications sink in. Their entire civilization ran on force-fueled technology. Their hyperdrives needed force-sensitive pilots to operate. Their weapons required force connection to function at their full potential. The plague stripped the Rakata of the very thing that made their empire work. As the Rakata began to lose their force connection, the enslaved species they had conquered began to resist. The uprisings happened across multiple worlds simultaneously. The lore suggests that this was not entirely coincidental, that some of the enslaved populations may have developed resistance to the Rakata's force-based control mechanisms. As the Rakata themselves weakened, humans on multiple worlds rose up. Other species followed. The Infinite Empire, which had seemed like a permanent fixture of galactic history, began to collapse from within. The Rakata fell into civil war as their population split between those who still retained some force connection and those who had lost it entirely. The ones who had lost their powers were considered lesser, cast out, treated the way they had treated their slaves. The social structure of Rakatan civilization turned inward and began to devour itself. Worlds that had been tightly held by the Empire suddenly found themselves without their Rakatan overseers, either because those overseers had died of the plague, been killed in the uprisings, or simply retreated back to Leon to deal with the internal chaos. The collapse of the Infinite Empire took several generations to complete. It was not a single dramatic moment, but a long, grinding decline that left the galaxy in a state of fragmentation. Hundreds of worlds that had been connected through Rakatan hyperlanes suddenly found themselves isolated. Species that had been enslaved had no ships of their own, no maps, no way to communicate across the distances the Rakatan had bridged. The galaxy went quiet. The lore suggests this period of isolation and fragmentation lasted for a very long time, centuries in some cases, before new civilizations began to independently rediscover or reinvent hyperspace travel. On Leon itself, the Rakata retreated into a state of primitive tribalism. The great technological civilization they had built, the one that had dominated the galaxy, crumbled into warring factions fighting with crude weapons over the ruins of their own former glory. The Star Forge orbited above them, still functional, still capable of producing weapons and ships at enormous scale. But the Rakata on the surface had lost the ability to meaningfully interface with it. It sat there, waiting. The legacy of the Infinite Empire is something the rest of galactic history never fully escapes. The hyperspace routes the Rakata mapped became the foundation for the routes that later civilizations would discover and use. The worlds they conquered carried the cultural and genetic marks of their occupation for thousands of years. And the Star Forge would eventually be found by someone with enough knowledge and enough dark side connection to use it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. What the fall of the Rakata gave the galaxy was, paradoxically, an opportunity. With the dominant power gone, with the hyperspace lanes becoming accessible to species that were developing their own starfaring capabilities, the conditions were in place for something new to emerge. The Republic would be that something new, though it would take centuries more to actually form. In the meantime, other civilizations were developing. The Duros are often cited in the lore as among the first species to independently develop hyperspace travel after the fall of the Rakata. The Corellians are another. These early spacefaring civilizations began to map their own routes, make their own contacts, build their own trade networks. The galaxy, that had been unified under Rakatan domination, was slowly, haltingly, beginning to connect itself again through voluntary contact and commerce, rather than conquest and slavery. The Jedi Order emerged on the planet Tython during this period of reconnection. The Jedi were not yet the Jedi we recognize. They were something older, something that one possible reading of the lore suggests was more balanced in its approach to the Force. The Jedi studied both the light and the dark, conceptualizing them as Ashla and Bogan, as two poles of a single spectrum. They were scholars and warriors and philosophers, living on a world that was itself deeply connected to the Force in ways that were not fully understood even by the Jedi themselves. Tython was a world that reacted to Force imbalance. If a Jedi strayed too far into the darkness, the planet itself would generate storms, eruptions, instabilities. The lore suggests this was not metaphorical. Tython's connection to the Force was so deep that the emotional and spiritual state of its Force-sensitive inhabitants could physically affect the planet's weather and geology. This made Tython both a sanctuary and a kind of natural enforcement mechanism for the Jedi's philosophy of balance. The Jedi Order had a hierarchy and a set of practices that looked superficially similar to the later Jedi Order, but were fundamentally different in their relationship to the dark side. Where the Jedi would eventually come to treat the dark side as something to be rejected entirely, the Jedi treated it as something to be understood and balanced against. This distinction matters enormously for what comes later, because the Jedi Order that eventually forms is in many ways a reaction against this older philosophy, rather than a continuation of it. A Force war erupted on Tython when individuals who had gone too deep into the dark side refused to return to balance. The Force Hounds, servants of the Rakatan Empire, played a role in this conflict that the lore suggests was more significant than simple military involvement. The Infinite Empire was in the process of expanding when the Jedi were dealing with their own internal conflicts, and the collision between these two forces shaped both of them. The Jedi survived. The Infinite Empire, as we've discussed, did not. After the Tython Force War, the Jedi began to change. The conflict with the dark side users in their own ranks, combined with the exposure to Rakatan methods and philosophy, pushed the Jedi toward a more rigid rejection of the dark side. The balance they had sought began to tip toward the light. Over generations, the Jedi Order transformed into something closer to the Jedi Order that the galaxy would eventually come to know, a body that celebrated the light side and treated the dark side as a corruption to be avoided rather than a force to be balanced. The proto-republic that was forming during this period was a loose collection of worlds connected by trade and shared interest. It was not yet a government in any meaningful sense. It was more of a network, a series of agreements and relationships between spacefaring civilizations that found it mutually beneficial to cooperate. The Coruscant Accord, which many historians of the Star Wars universe point to as a founding moment of the Republic, was initially just a trade agreement between a handful of core worlds. The Jedi Order, as it evolved from the Jedi, aligned itself with the nascent Republic early. This alignment was not inevitable. The lore suggests there were factions within the early Jedi who argued that the Order should remain politically neutral, that committing to the Republic would entangle the Jedi in exactly the kind of political disputes that were incompatible with their philosophy. But the pragmatic faction won. The Jedi became the peacekeeping arm of the Republic, and that relationship would define galactic politics for the next 25,000 years. The early Republic expanded quickly by historical standards, but slowly by the standards of what came before and after. The Rakata had conquered hundreds of worlds in relatively short order. The Republic grew through diplomacy, negotiation, and the gradual extension of its legal and political framework to new member worlds. This was a fundamentally different model of expansion, and it produced a fundamentally different kind of civilization, one that was more resilient in some ways and more vulnerable in others. Resilient, because the Republic's member worlds had chosen to join rather than been conquered. Voluntary membership created a different kind of loyalty. Worlds that had agreed to the Republic's terms generally had a stake in its success, but vulnerable, because the Republic's model of governance was slow, consensus-based, and dependent on the willingness of member worlds to abide by agreements they had made. When worlds stopped wanting to abide by those agreements, the Republic had limited tools for compelling them to comply. The Jedi were one of those tools, not in a coercive sense, at least not initially, but in the sense that Jedi diplomats and peacekeepers could often resolve disputes before they escalated into conflicts that would tear member worlds away from the Republic. The Jedi served as mediators, arbiters, and occasionally as warriors when mediation failed. This role suited both the Jedi philosophy, which valued peace, and the Republic's institutional needs. The development of the Jedi Code during this early period is something the lore touches on, but does not fully detail. What we can piece together suggests that the code evolved gradually, shaped by specific conflicts and crises that the early Jedi encountered. The prohibition on emotional attachment, for instance, seems to have developed in response to specific cases where Jedi who formed strong personal attachments made compromised decisions that had catastrophic consequences. The code was not handed down from some ancient authority. It was built, piece by piece, from experience. The Sith, as a distinct group, had not yet emerged at this point in the timeline. The concept of a Sith Order, of a philosophy of the dark side organized around power and domination, would come later, but the conditions that would produce the Sith were already present. There were always Force-sensitive individuals who pushed against the Jedi's restrictions, who wanted to explore aspects of the Force that the Order had declared off limits, who chafed under the hierarchy and discipline of Jedi life. These individuals would eventually coalesce into something organized and dangerous. The 1,000-year period following the founding of the Republic is sometimes called the Golden Age, though the lore suggests this label is more aspirational than descriptive. Yes, the Republic was expanding. Yes, the Jedi were maintaining relative peace across a large number of worlds. But there were conflicts. There were crises. There were moments when the whole project seemed on the verge of unraveling. The Golden Age label obscures how fragile the early Republic actually was. One of the most significant early crises was the 100-Year Darkness, which we'll cover in the next chapter. But even before that, there were wars, schisms within the Jedi Order, political crises within the Republic's Senate, and moments where individual worlds chose to pursue their interests in ways that destabilized the broader community. The Republic of this era was not the stable institution it would eventually become. It was something being built in real time by people who were figuring it out as they went. The role of the Jedi Council in this early period is worth noting. The Council as an institution was still being defined. The 12-member body that we recognize from the prequel era did not exist in this form from the beginning. The structure of Jedi governance evolved alongside the structure of Republic governance, each shaping the other. The lore suggests a period of significant debate within the Jedi Order about how decisions should be made, who should make them, and how the Order should relate to the Republic Senate. Commerce and trade were the lifeblood of the early Republic. The core worlds, those planets closest to the galactic center, had developed sophisticated economies and manufacturing bases that made them natural hubs for interplanetary trade. Planets in the mid-rim and outer rim provided resources, agricultural products, and exotic goods that the core worlds needed. This economic interdependence was the practical foundation of the Republic's political unity. It gave member worlds a material reason to stay in the coalition, beyond idealism or shared values. The Force itself behaved somewhat differently during this era, or at least the understanding of it was different. The Jedi of the early Republic period did not have the fully developed philosophy of the Force that would characterize the Order in later centuries. They were still learning, still discovering what the Force was and what it could do. Midi-chlorians were understood, but their relationship to Force sensitivity was not as systematically studied as it would become. The Jedi were empiricists in the truest sense, trying to build understanding from direct experience. Military force, despite the Republic's preference for diplomacy, was always part of the picture. The Republic maintained a defense force from early in its existence, and the Jedi served as its most elite warriors. The clone army of a later era was still thousands of years in the future, but the Republic Navy and ground forces were real and active during this period. Several of the conflicts the Republic faced in its first millennium required military solutions that the Jedi and Republic forces provided together. The expansion of the Republic into the Outer Rim was always more complicated than the expansion through the core and mid-rim. The Outer Rim was vast, sparsely settled by galactic standards, and home to civilizations that had developed independently of Republic influence for centuries. Some of these civilizations welcomed Republic contact, others resisted. The process of extending Republic law and governance to the Outer Rim was messy, contested, and never fully completed even by the height of the Republic's power. Criminal organizations, piracy, and lawlessness were endemic to the Outer Rim during this period for reasons that are easy to understand. When you have a vast region of space with limited Republic presence and strong incentives for profit, the conditions for criminal enterprise are essentially built in. The Hutts were active during this era, building the criminal networks that would eventually make them a galactic power in their own right. The Mandalorians were also active, as warriors and mercenaries whose code of honor made them formidable fighters, but not necessarily reliable allies. The relationship between the Republic and the Mandalorians in this early period was complicated. The Mandalorians were not yet the existential threat they would become in later eras. They were a warrior culture, with their own territory and their own code, and they occasionally clashed with Republic interests, occasionally cooperated, and generally existed as a parallel civilization rather than an enemy or a client state. The foundation of what would eventually become the Mandalorian Wars was being laid during this period, though the war itself was still centuries away. Non-human species in the Republic faced discrimination and inequality that the Republic's founding ideals did not officially sanction, but did very little to prevent. The law suggests that the early Republic, despite its rhetoric of universal membership and equal rights, was dominated by human and near-human species in ways that created systematic disadvantages for other species. This tension would periodically erupt into political crises and occasionally into open conflict. It was also a recruiting tool for groups that opposed the Republic. The Jedi Order's relationship to non-human species was generally better than the Republic's broader relationship, partly because force sensitivity did not respect species lines. The Jedi had members from dozens of species, and in principle the Order valued ability and dedication over species origin. In practice, there were biases, as there are in any human institution, but the principle of universal membership was genuinely held by most Jedi, which made the Order somewhat more inclusive than the Republic Senate or the Republic military. Philosophy within the Jedi Order was not monolithic. From the very beginning, there were different schools of thought about what the Jedi were for, how they should train, what relationship they should have to the dark side, and how they should engage with the political world. These philosophical debates were mostly conducted peacefully, through argument and council deliberation, but they also produced factions, and sometimes those factions split into something more serious. The seeds of every major Jedi schism in the Old Republic era were planted in this early period of philosophical diversity. Technology across the Republic was advancing, though not at the pace we might assume. Hyperdrive technology was improving, medical technology was developing, weapons technology was evolving, though the lightsaber as we know it would not exist for some time. The early Jedi used a variety of weapons and were not exclusively associated with a single weapon type. The lightsaber emerged from the Jedi's experiments with kyber crystals and plasma containment, and it became the signature weapon of the Order through a process that happened over centuries rather than as the result of a single invention moment. The Sith language and Sith artifacts that archaeologists of later eras would study had their origins in this period. The dark side cults and splinter groups that eventually became the Sith were leaving traces on multiple worlds, in tombs and temples and hidden texts that would be rediscovered centuries later with dramatic consequences. The darkness that would become the Sith Empire was not created in a single moment. It accumulated slowly in the margins and shadows of the early Republic's history. By the end of this first chapter of Old Republic history, the galaxy looks recognizable in its broad outlines. There's a Republic, there's a Jedi Order, there are trade routes and member worlds, and Senate debates, but the details of this galaxy are dramatically different from anything we see in the prequel trilogy or the original trilogy. The scale of time involved is almost incomprehensible. We are 25,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. Everything that we recognize as Star Wars is still an unimaginable distance in the future. The Rakatan ruins are still relatively fresh. Leon still has Rakata living on it, in a state of tribal primitiveness. The Star Forge is still there, still orbiting, still waiting. The Jedi Order has transformed into the Jedi Order, but that transformation is still recent enough that the wounds of it are fresh. There are Jedi alive during this period who remember being taught the older way, who carry the memory of the Jedi philosophy, and who wonder if the turn away from balance was the right choice. Those doubts will matter. The galaxy is vast and incompletely explored. There are regions where the Republic has never sent a ship, where species exist in total isolation from galactic civilization. Some of those isolated civilizations will eventually be drawn into Republic history, sometimes by choice and sometimes by the violent intrusion of forces they did not choose to meet. The galaxy of this era is full of possibility in a way that later eras are not, because the choices that will define everything downstream have not yet been made. What I want you to take away from this opening chapter is a sense of the extraordinary depth of time we're dealing with. When people talk about Star Wars lore, they often focus on the immediate centuries around the films, but the Old Republic era stretches back so far that the stories of Anakin Skywalker and Luke Skywalker are from the perspective of the earliest Old Republic, something like ancient mythology in the far future. The civilization that produced those stories was built on thousands of years of prior history, and that history shaped every choice, every institution, every belief system that the characters in the films inhabited. The Rakata left the galaxy changed. The Jedi became the Jedi joined the Republic expanded, and in the dark corners of that expanding galaxy, in the ruins of Rakatan temples, and in the hearts of Jedi who had been told not to feel, the conditions for everything that followed were already taking shape. Chapter 2: The 100-Year Darkness and the Birth of the Sith. The schism that produced the Sith did not come from nowhere. It had been building for a long time. Within the Jedi Order, there had always been those who questioned the restrictions placed on Force exploration, who felt that the Council's approach to the dark side was less about wisdom and more about fear. For centuries, these dissenters had been managed, argued down, or quietly expelled from the Order. But eventually a group of them organized, and what they proposed was radical enough to break the Order apart. The individual history calls the Dark Jedi, the leader of what became the 100-Year Darkness, is known from fragmentary sources that suggest rather than fully confirm the narrative. What those sources point toward is a Jedi of considerable power and intellectual ability, who became convinced that manipulating the essence of living creatures through the Force was not only possible, but could be a source of enormous power. This practice, which the law refers to as Sith alchemy in its later developed form, was fundamentally about reshaping life itself through the dark side. The Jedi Council prohibited this line of research absolutely. The reasons given were both philosophical and practical. Philosophically, the manipulation of living beings through the Force was considered a violation of the natural order, a use of power that corrupted both the practitioner and the subject. Practically, the early experiments that had been conducted suggested that the results were unstable, unpredictable, and prone to producing things that were deeply dangerous. The Council drew the line and refused to move it. The dissenters refused to accept that line. They continued their research in secret, and when the Council discovered this, the confrontation that resulted was not a political dispute that could be resolved through negotiation. It was a fundamental break over what the Force was for and who had the right to determine the limits of its use. The dissenters were expelled from the Order, but expulsion was not the end, it was the beginning. The expelled Jedi gathered allies and launched what became known as the 100-Year Darkness, a war against the Jedi Order and the Republic that lasted, as the name suggests, roughly a century. This was not a brushfire conflict. This was a sustained, destructive war that caused enormous casualties on both sides and left deep scars on the Republic worlds where it was fought. The Dark Jedi had access to the same training and capabilities as the Jedi they fought, and in some cases, their willingness to use the dark side without restriction gave them tactical advantages that the Jedi struggled to counter. The dark side experiments that had triggered the schism continued during the war. The lore suggests that the Dark Jedi produced Force-corrupted creatures, monstrous entities created by warping living beings through the dark side that they deployed as weapons. These creatures, which the lore sometimes refers to as Leviathans, were capable of draining the Force from other living beings, weakening Force-sensitive opponents in a way that conventional weapons could not. The Jedi found them horrifying, and not just for practical reasons. The war ended at the Battle of Korbos, where the Jedi decisively defeated the Dark Jedi. But defeat on the battlefield was not execution. The Republic and the Jedi made a choice at Korbos that would have consequences reaching thousands of years into the future. Rather than killing the defeated Dark Jedi, They exiled them. They stripped them of their equipment, put them on ships, pointed those ships at the edge of known space, and sent them away. The reasoning, as the law suggests it, was that execution was not the Jedi way, that mercy was a demonstration of the superiority of the light side philosophy. What the Jedi did not know, could not have known without looking further into the future than even Force visions allowed, was where those ships would end up. The exiled Dark Jedi, their ships traveling through hyperspace, on trajectories that took them beyond the explored galaxy, eventually arrived in the Stygian caldera, a region of space dominated by nebulae and hazards that made navigation extremely difficult. Inside that region they found a planet. On that planet they found the Sith species. The Sith were a Force-sensitive species who had developed their own relationship with the Force, independently of the Jedi. The Sith relationship with the Force was dominated by passion, by desire, by the emotional intensity that the Jedi had been taught to suppress. They practiced what would later be systematized as Sith sorcery, rituals and techniques that channeled the Force through strong emotion in ways that were alien to Jedi practice, but not entirely incomprehensible to the exiled Dark Jedi who had been pushing the boundaries of Force philosophy themselves. The meeting between the exiled Dark Jedi and the Sith species was, from the perspective of the Sith, the arrival of powerful beings who seemed almost like gods. From the perspective of the Dark Jedi, it was the discovery of a population of Force-sensitive beings who were already predisposed to the dark side philosophy, and who offered both a power base and a source of knowledge. The Dark Jedi quickly established themselves as rulers of the Sith species. The law suggests this process was partly coercive and partly consensual, with some Sith welcoming the Dark Jedi as the superior beings their traditions had predicted would come, and others resenting the newcomers but having no effective means of resistance. Over generations, the Dark Jedi and the Sith species intermingled. Interbreeding occurred, cultural exchange happened. The dark side philosophies of the two groups merged and evolved into something new, a synthesis that was more sophisticated than either had been separately. The result of this synthesis was the Sith Order as a philosophical and religious tradition, complete with its own hierarchies, its own approach to Force training, its own military organization, and its own political structure, centered on the concept of a Sith emperor ruling over an empire. The early Sith Empire was built on Korriban, which became the sacred world of the Sith, the place where the most powerful Sith lords were entombed in elaborate valley complexes. Korriban was already strong in the dark side before the Sith arrived. The planet had a presence in the Force that was unsettling to non-Force sensitives and overwhelming to Force sensitives who were not prepared for it. The Sith built their tombs there because they believed that the dark side presence of the planet would preserve their power even after death, allowing them to continue to influence events through Force echoes and ghosts. The Valley of the Dark Lords on Korriban became one of the most significant locations in the galaxy. During the Old Republic era, each great Sith Lord who died was interred there in a tomb that was itself a monument to their power, filled with traps, guardians, and dark side artifacts that tested anyone who sought to access the knowledge the tomb contained. The tradition of the Sith tomb, as both memorial and puzzle box, as a place where power could be found by those strong enough to claim it, says something fundamental about Sith philosophy. Power was not given, it was taken. The Sith Empire expanded across the Stygian caldera during the centuries following the exile. The original Sith species were the core of the population, but the Sith system of accepting any species that demonstrated sufficient strength and devotion to Sith philosophy meant that the Empire eventually encompassed multiple species. The pure-blood Sith, as the original species came to be called, occupied a privileged position in Sith society, but power ultimately trumped bloodline for advancement to the highest levels. For nearly 2,000 years after the Battle of Corvus, the Sith Empire and the Republic existed without knowing the other existed. The Stygian caldera was outside explored space. The Republic had no maps of that region. The Sith had no interest in revealing themselves before they were ready. Both civilizations developed in parallel, each growing stronger, each building institutions and traditions and military forces. The collision, when it finally came, would be one of the defining events of the entire Old Republic era. The Sith philosophy that developed during these 2,000 years of isolation was profoundly shaped by the experience of the exile that had created it. The Dark Jedi who founded the Sith Order had been rejected by the Republic and the Jedi. They had been told that their approach to the Force was wrong, that their curiosity was corruption, that their desire for power was weakness. The Sith philosophy that emerged in response was built around the explicit rejection of everything the Jedi stood for. The Jedi valued peace, the Sith valued power, the Jedi suppressed emotion, the Sith channeled it, the Jedi served the Republic, the Sith Empire served the Sith. The rule of two had not yet been invented. The Sith of this early period operated under a system that allowed many Sith Lords to exist simultaneously, with a hierarchy of power but no single figure holding absolute dominance. This would eventually prove to be both a strength and a weakness. It was a strength in the sense that it produced many powerful Sith and distributed their capabilities across a wide organization. It was a weakness in the sense that competition between Sith Lords could be destructive, that ambitious Sith would sometimes undermine each other, and that the constant internal power struggles consumed resources and energy that might have been directed outward. The Sith military during this period was formidable. The combination of Sith sorcery, conventional military technology, and a warrior culture that valued martial excellence produced an armed force that was qualitatively different from anything the Republic had. Sith warriors trained differently, fought differently, and were motivated by a philosophy that made retreat and surrender options they would choose only under the most extreme circumstances. The Republic's military had advantages in numbers and logistics. The Sith military had advantages in intensity and in the tactical use of force abilities. Meanwhile, back in Republic space, the Jedi Order was changing. The 100-year darkness had been traumatic. The knowledge that Jedi could fall so completely, could turn so decisively against everything the Order stood for, produced a period of significant introspection and institutional reform. The restrictions on certain areas of Force study were tightened. The process by which potential Jedis were evaluated and trained was formalized more rigorously. The emphasis on emotional detachment in Jedi training became more pronounced. These reforms solved some problems and created others. The tighter restrictions on Force study meant that the Order's knowledge of the dark side became more limited over time, which would eventually be a tactical disadvantage when the Sith appeared. The more rigorous evaluation of candidates meant that some Force-sensitive individuals who might have thrived in the Order were turned away, and those individuals sometimes developed their abilities outside the Order's framework in ways that were not always benign. And the increased emphasis on detachment created Jedi who were disciplined but sometimes disconnected from the living Force in ways that the most critical voices within the Order worried about. The Republic Senate, during this period, was evolving as well. The early Senate had been relatively small and manageable. As the Republic expanded to include more and more member worlds, the Senate grew to a size that made it increasingly difficult to function efficiently. Procedural rules accumulated, bureaucracy expanded. The process of actually making decisions became slower and more complicated. This institutional drift toward paralysis would be a recurring problem for the Republic throughout its history. Trade disputes between member worlds were a constant source of tension in the Senate. The more economically developed core worlds often pursued trade policies that benefited themselves at the expense of less developed rim worlds. The Outer Rim, in particular, developed a persistent resentment of core world dominance that would periodically express itself as political separatism, or in the worst cases, as military conflict. The Republic's political system was not well designed for managing these tensions. The Jedi's role in managing political tensions was a subject of ongoing debate. Some Jedi argued that deep involvement in Republic politics compromised the Order's independence and its ability to serve as a neutral arbiter. Others argued that refusing to engage with politics was itself a political choice, one that effectively favored the status quo and the interests of the powerful. The Council navigated between these positions case by case, sometimes deeply involved in political crises and sometimes standing apart, which satisfied no one fully and often seemed inconsistent to outside observers. Force traditions, other than the Jedi, existed throughout the Republic during this period. The lore suggests dozens of distinct Force-using traditions on various worlds, some small and local, some larger and more organized. Most of these were not affiliated with the Jedi Order and had no desire to be. Some practiced approaches to the Force that the Jedi considered dangerous. The Jedi's official position was generally to monitor these groups without persecuting them, though the line between monitoring and suppression was sometimes crossed. The diversity of Force traditions during this era would be dramatically reduced by events later in the timeline. The Mandalorians were becoming an increasingly significant factor in galactic politics. The Mandalorian warrior culture had spread beyond its original homeworld of Mandalore, absorbing other warrior cultures and species into a confederation defined more by a shared code than by shared ethnicity. The lore points toward this period as one of significant Mandalorian expansion, as clans ranged across the Outer Rim taking contracts, raiding, or simply proving their worth as warriors. Their relationship with the Republic was in this period one of mutual wariness rather than outright hostility. The Hutt cartel was also expanding its reach during this period. The Hutts had a particular genius for commerce and organization that made them natural operators in the legally grey zones of the Outer Rim. They offered services that the Republic either could not or would not provide in the regions where the Republic's reach was thin. Smuggling, gambling, slavery, mercenary contracting. The Hutts built an empire of the shadow economy that coexisted with and often exploited the gaps in Republic governance. The lore suggests that even during this early period, certain Republic politicians had relationships with the Hutts that were, at minimum, ethically complicated. The Sith species in the Empire had begun to develop their own internal hierarchies that were distinct from the hierarchy of force power. Sith lords commanded Sith warriors, who commanded Sith soldiers. But alongside this military hierarchy ran a parallel structure of Sith priests and Sith alchemists, who held their own forms of power. The tension between the military wing and the scholarly wing of the Sith Order was a constant undercurrent in Sith political life. Both wings agreed that power was the ultimate value. They disagreed about what kind of power mattered most. Sith alchemy, during this period, produced some of the most unsettling artifacts in the Star Wars galaxy. The Sith alchemists worked with living matter, with metals and crystals, and with the dark side itself to create objects and creatures that defied ordinary physical laws. Sith swords that could wound through force shields, holocrons that contained the knowledge of dead Sith lords in a form that could be accessed at great cost by their successors, Rakhul plagues, or precursors to them, that could transform infected beings into something monstrous. The Sith relationship to life itself was one of use and transformation rather than respect. Hyperspace exploration during this period, on both the Republic and Sith sides, was proceeding steadily if slowly. Mapping hyperspace routes was dangerous work. Hyperspace was not empty. It contained anomalies, gravity wells, and phenomena that did not have good explanations in contemporary physics, but that could destroy a ship that encountered them without warning. The scouts who mapped new routes were some of the most adventurous and most expendable individuals in the galaxy, and the casualty rate among them was substantial. As the first millennium of the Sith Empire approached its end, the Empire had grown into a substantial civilization with a complex internal politics, a formidable military, and a body of dark side knowledge that the Republic had no idea existed. The Sith Lords who governed this empire were not crude power seekers, or at least, not only that, they were scholars of the Force, strategists of extraordinary sophistication, and philosophers who had developed a coherent, if disturbing, worldview that explained and justified everything they did. When the collision with the Republic finally came, it would not be a clash between civilization and barbarism. It would be a clash between two fully developed civilizations with incompatible visions of what the galaxy should be. The moment that breaks the isolation comes from an unexpected direction. A Jedi exploration team, venturing into uncharted space, stumbles onto Sith territory. The exact circumstances of this first contact vary in different telling of the lore, but the core fact is consistent. The Republic discovered that there was an empire in the dark, and that empire had been waiting for a very long time. Chapter 3: The Great Hyperspace War. The Jedi explorers who first made contact with the Sith Empire did not survive the encounter in most versions of the lore. The Sith did not regard their discovery as a diplomatic opportunity. They regarded it as a security breach, and they treated it accordingly. The question then became what to do about it. The Sith Emperor of this era, Marka Ragnos, was ancient, immensely powerful, and cautious in a way that not all Sith leaders were. He recognized that the Republic was large, and that moving against it without adequate preparation was a risk that could not be accepted. Marka Ragnos died before he could resolve this strategic question, and his death triggered a succession crisis that would paradoxically be the thing that brought the Sith Empire into direct conflict with the Republic. The two most powerful Sith lords vying to replace Ragnos were Naga Sadow and Ludo Kresh, and they held fundamentally different views about what the Sith Empire should do about the Republic. Kresh was the cautious one. He argued that the Republic was too large, that attacking it was too risky, that the Sith should consolidate their power and wait for a better opportunity. Sadow was the aggressive one. He wanted to strike, believed the Republic was weak, and saw the succession struggle as an opportunity to prove his own supremacy by delivering a dramatic victory. The two Republic explorers who had stumbled into Sith space became pawns in this internal Sith dispute. Naga Sadow orchestrated a rescue of the explorers from Sith custody, framed Kresh as responsible for a supposed Republic attack, and used the resulting chaos to seize leadership of the Sith Empire. It was a breathtakingly audacious piece of political manipulation, and it worked. With the succession settled in his favor and the internal opposition neutralized, Naga Sadow launched the invasion that would become known as the Great Hyperspace War. The invasion of Republic space by the Sith Empire was something the Republic had absolutely no preparation for. The Sith came through hyperspace routes that the Republic had not mapped, emerging at multiple points simultaneously in a coordinated strategy that suggests Sadow had planned this for a long time regardless of what the political circumstances were. Sith warships attacked Republic worlds across a broad front. Sith Massassi warriors, the near-feral Sith subspecies used as shock troops, landed on planets and engaged in close combat with Republic defenders. Sith sorcerers accompanied the invasion forces and used dark side techniques to amplify confusion and fear among defenders. The Republic was not entirely unprepared in the sense that it had a military, but that military was not designed for this kind of threat. Republic defense forces had been built around managing internal security and handling the limited-scale conflicts that arose from piracy, rebellion, or border disputes between member worlds. They were not built for a total war against an organized empire with sophisticated military technology and force-using commanders. The early battles of the Great Hyperspace War went badly for the Republic. The Jedi response to the invasion was critical. The Jedi Order mobilized its warriors and deployed them as commanders and strike forces alongside the Republic military. Jedi Knights and Jedi Masters proved to be effective counters to the Sith commanders in individual engagements. The Force ability that both sides brought to the battlefield gave encounters a character that was fundamentally different from purely conventional military clashes. Sith Lords could use battle meditation, a technique that enhanced the combat effectiveness of allied forces while degrading the will of enemies. Jedi who could counter this technique were invaluable. The battle over Coruscant itself was a moment of genuine crisis. Sith forces reached the Republic capital, and the fighting there was devastating. The lore suggests that Naga Sadow personally led part of the assault on Coruscant, using his immense force power to create illusions and sensory distortions that multiplied the apparent size of his forces. For a time, it seemed possible that the Republic capital would fall. If Coruscant had fallen, the psychological and political blow would have been catastrophic, potentially breaking the Republic coalition apart as member worlds concluded that resistance was futile. But Sadow's victory was not as complete as it appeared. The illusions he used were effective against the uninitiated, but Jedi could see through them with enough focus and skill. Once the illusions were identified and countered, the true size of the Sith force became apparent, and the defenders were able to concentrate their strength more effectively. Sado was forced to retreat from Coruscant, with his objective unachieved. And the retreat from Coruscant was not the only reversal he suffered. Ludo Kresh, the rival Sado had outmaneuvered, had not given up. He had been building his own forces, and he struck Sado from behind, as Sado was engaged with the Republic. The Sith Empire's internal power struggle had not ended with Sado's victory in the succession dispute. It had merely been deferred. With the Republic rallying and Kresh attacking from behind, Sado found himself in an impossible strategic position. He was forced to withdraw from Republic space entirely. The Republic counterattack that followed the Sith withdrawal was aggressive and successful. Republic forces followed the Sith back through the hyperspace routes Sado's invasion had inadvertently revealed, bringing the war into Sith territory. On Korriban and on other Sith worlds, the Republic military fought and won a series of engagements that shattered the organized military power of the Sith Empire. The Sith Emperor's forces were broken. Naga Sado fled. The lore suggests he eventually ended up on Yavin 4, where he went into Sith stasis and slept for centuries in a tomb that would later be of interest to the Sith Lord Exar Kun. But before his flight, Sado destroyed much of his own fleet to prevent his enemies, both the Republic and Kresh, from capturing his ships and technology. This scorched earth approach to retreat was very Sith, but it also meant that the Great Hyperspace War ended with the Sith Empire dramatically weakened. The aftermath of the Great Hyperspace War was complicated. The Republic had won, but the victory was costly and left a long shadow. The Sith Empire, as an organized political entity, was shattered, at least for the time being. But individual Sith Lords survived. Knowledge survived. The traditions and philosophy that had produced the Sith Empire were not destroyed along with the military that had carried it. The lore suggests that the Republic made a strategic error in the aftermath of the war by not following up the military victory with a more thorough effort to hunt down surviving Sith and recover or destroy Sith knowledge. The Republic's reluctance to pursue the Sith completely reflected a genuine ethical dilemma. How far should a democracy go in pursuing an enemy? The Republic's identity was built around law, due process, and the idea that power should be constrained by principle. The Jedi shared this instinct, hunting down every surviving Sith, regardless of whether they posed an immediate threat, felt like the kind of thing the Sith would do, not the kind of thing the Republic should do. This ethical restraint was admirable and also arguably a strategic mistake of the First Order. Korriban was quarantined rather than occupied. The Republic declared it off-limits and placed monitoring stations around the system to detect any attempt to resettle the world. This solution satisfied the requirement for action without requiring the Republic to commit to an indefinite occupation of a planet that was deeply inhospitable, and that many Republic soldiers and politicians wanted to leave as quickly as possible. The tombs remained, the dark side presence remained, and eventually the quarantine would fail to hold. The political consequences of the Great Hyperspace War within the Republic were significant. The war had demonstrated that the Republic's military was inadequate for large-scale external threats. It had demonstrated that the Jedi, for all their capabilities, could not substitute for a professional military force of sufficient size and capability. And it had demonstrated that the Republic's intelligence about the wider galaxy was embarrassingly limited. These lessons were absorbed to some degree. Military budgets were increased. The Republic Navy was expanded, but the institutional momentum of a civilization that had not faced existential external threat for so long was difficult to reverse quickly. The Jedi Order's internal debates intensified after the war. The encounter with the Sith had raised disturbing questions. The dark side philosophy that had produced the Sith was not something alien and incomprehensible. It was a development from the same roots as Jedi philosophy. The exile that had created the Sith had been Jedi. The force they used was the same force the Jedi used. The Jedi could not regard the Sith as simply monsters or aberrations. They had to regard them as a warning about what Jedi could become, and that was deeply unsettling. Some Jedi argued for increased study of Sith techniques in order to better combat them. These arguments were rejected by the Council, which maintained that studying the dark side in depth was too dangerous, that the knowledge gained was not worth the risk of corruption. This decision would be revisited multiple times throughout Old Republic history, always with the same outcome, which suggests either that the Council was right or that the Council had an institutional blindness on this particular question that no amount of evidence could dislodge. The Sith survivors who scattered after the war did not simply disappear. They went underground, integrated into Republic society in some cases, established hidden redoubts in remote parts of the galaxy in others. Some found their way to worlds where they could practice their arts without attracting attention. Some established themselves as dark side scholars, operating under cover identities. The diaspora of the Sith, after the Great Hyperspace War, was the source from which the dark side tradition would eventually reconstitute itself. The Mandalorian clans watched the Great Hyperspace War with interest. The war had revealed that there were civilizations beyond the edges of explored space, that hyperspace routes led to places that were not charted. This was information that the more adventurous Mandalorian clans found extremely interesting. The Mandalorians had always been defined by the search for worthy opponents, for challenges that tested their martial culture to its limits. The knowledge that there were Sith out there, that there were wars being fought at a scale that dwarfed anything they had previously been involved in, was the kind of information that excited certain Mandalorian leaders in ways that would eventually have consequences. For several centuries after the Great Hyperspace War, the Republic experienced what historians sometimes call a period of recovery and relative stability. The Sith threat appeared to have been eliminated, or at least reduced to a level that did not require constant military mobilization. Trade resumed. The Senate returned to its normal rhythms of procedural debate and factional competition. The Jedi Order rebuilt its ranks and refined its training protocols. The galaxy breathed. But underneath the apparent stability, the forces that would produce the next crisis were already at work. Sith knowledge was spreading, carried by the survivors and by the artifacts that had been left on Korriban and other Sith worlds. Dark-side scholars were studying that knowledge in secret. Certain individuals within the Republic, disillusioned by the war or simply ambitious, were making contact with what remained of the Sith tradition. And on the ancient Sith worlds, the tombs of Korriban were waiting for someone to come and claim what was inside them. The lore suggests that this period of apparent calm was not fully as peaceful as the official Republic histories of the era record. There were incidents, clashes with dark side users, investigations by the Jedi that ended badly or that uncovered things the Order preferred not to make public. The Republic's relationship to its own history was always complicated by the desire to project confidence, to reassure member worlds that the threats had been dealt with and that there was nothing to fear. Transparency was not the Republic's default setting, and the Jedi were not immune to the same institutional instinct to suppress uncomfortable information. The technology of the era was continuing to advance. Starship design was improving. Weapons systems were becoming more sophisticated. The lightsaber had, by this point, become the signature weapon of the Jedi, and the techniques of lightsaber combat were being systematized into what would eventually become the formalized combat forms of the later Republic era. Jedi younglings were being trained from an increasingly young age, which the lore suggests was a response to the 100-year darkness and the concern that older initiates were harder to instill with the right attitudes and values. The political structure of the Republic was also evolving. The Supreme Chancellor, the executive position at the head of the Republic government, had been relatively weak. In the early Republic, the Great Hyperspace War had led to an expansion of executive power as the crisis required faster decision-making than the Senate could provide. After the war ended, some of that expanded power was rolled back, but not all of it. The precedent of emergency executive power had been set, and it would be invoked again. The Republic's justice system was another institution that was developing during this period. The Articles of Unity that governed the Republic's basic law were being interpreted, extended, and sometimes contested in ways that shaped the relationship between the central government and member worlds. The tension between central authority and local sovereignty was a constant feature of Republic politics, and the legal institutions that mediated that tension were constantly being tested. The end of this chapter in Old Republic history is not a single dramatic event, but a gradual accumulation of conditions. The Republic is stable, but not invulnerable. The Sith are scattered, but not destroyed. The Jedi are influential, but also constrained by their own philosophy, in ways that their enemies do not share. The galaxy is full of people, institutions, and forces that are pursuing their own interests in ways that will eventually collide with each other in ways no one has fully anticipated. The Great Hyperspace War is over. The next war is already being prepared for, though no one knows it yet. Chapter 4: The Exar Kun War and the Brotherhood of Darkness. A Jedi student named Exar Kun was on his way to becoming either one of the Order's greatest practitioners or one of its most dangerous failures, and the difference between those two outcomes was razor thin and ultimately determined by choices that seemed small at the time. Kun was brilliant, aggressive in his curiosity, and constitutionally resistant to the idea that any area of knowledge should be off limits. The Jedi Council recognized his ability, and they also recognized his dangerous qualities, and they gave him a master who was supposed to be able to manage both. The experiment failed. Kun's path to the dark side ran through the archives. He found references to Sith knowledge, to techniques and philosophies that the Order had classified and locked away. The fact that it was locked made it more interesting, not less. He found ways to access materials he was not supposed to access. He read things that were supposed to be too dangerous for an uncompleted Padawan to encounter. And instead of corrupting him immediately, as the Council might have feared, the reading made him more determined to seek out the primary sources. He wanted to find the actual Sith teachings, not the Jedi's filtered versions of them. His journey eventually took him to Onderon, to Yavin 4, and eventually to Korriban, where the tomb of Freedon Nad held both the physical remains of a fallen Jedi and an extraordinary concentration of dark side knowledge. Nad was a Jedi who had turned to the dark side generations before Kun's time, a figure of considerable infamy in the Order's history. His tomb on Dexon and the Sith knowledge he had carried to Onderon had already caused significant problems, but the knowledge he had left behind was also a resource that Kun was willing to pay any price to access. The price the dark side exacted from Exar Kun was not immediately obvious. That is one of the most consistently described features of dark side corruption in the lore. It rarely announces itself. It does not tell you that you are being corrupted. It offers you power, understanding, freedom from artificial constraints. The corruption comes gradually, in the form of choices that each seem individually justifiable, but that collectively move you somewhere you would not have chosen to go if you could see the destination at the beginning. Kun encountered the spirit of Freedon Nad, and was nearly destroyed by it. The encounter left him at a choice point: die here in this tomb, or accept the power Nad was offering. He chose to live. He accepted the power, and, in doing so, he made a commitment to the dark side that he would rationalize and build on for the rest of his life, but never genuinely reconsider. The lore suggests that after this point, the Exar Kun who existed was someone fundamentally different from the one who had entered the tomb. Not in any superficial way, but at the level of deep motivation. Meanwhile, another young Jedi, named Ulic Qualdroma, was pursuing his own path that would intersect with Kun's in ways that neither of them planned. Qualdroma was a different type from Kun, where Kun was motivated primarily by the desire for knowledge and power. Qualdroma's trajectory into darkness ran through loss and grief, and a terrible conviction that he could infiltrate the dark side without being changed by it. He believed he could pretend to fall in order to destroy the enemy from within. This is perhaps the most classically tragic motivation in the Jedi Falls of the Old Republic era. The belief that one can use the darkness as a tool and remain clean. The Krath, a dark side cult that had taken over the Empress Teta system, were the immediate target of Qualdroma's infiltration plan. The Krath had already killed other Jedi who had confronted them directly. Qualdroma argued to the Jedi Council that direct confrontation had failed and that a different approach was needed. The Council, refused to sanction his infiltration plan. He went anyway. This pattern of a Jedi defined the Council's authority for what they believed were good reasons, and then discovering that they were not as immune to the dark side as they had thought, would repeat several times throughout Old Republic history. Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma found each other through the dark side. Their meeting, which the lore suggests was partly engineered by the spirit of Freedon Nad and other Sith ghosts, who saw in these two talented young men the instruments of a Sith revival, was both a meeting of equals and the beginning of a partnership that would shake the Republic. Kun was proclaimed the Dark Lord of the Sith, reviving a title that had not been used since the Great Hyperspace War. Qel-Droma became his apprentice, though the dynamic between them was always more complicated than simple master and student. What Exar Kun and Qel-Droma created together was the Brotherhood of Darkness, a Sith organization that recruited disaffected Jedi and other dark side practitioners and organized them into a genuine military and political force capable of threatening the Republic. The Brotherhood was not simply an army. It was a movement with a philosophy, a counter-establishment that positioned itself as an alternative to both the Republic and the Jedi. Some of the people who joined it did so out of genuine ideological conviction. Others joined because they had already fallen and needed community. Others joined for more practical reasons: power, resources, the protection of belonging to an organization that the Jedi and the Republic took seriously. The war that resulted, sometimes called the Sith War or the Exar Kun War, involved fighting across multiple systems and drew in virtually every major faction in the Republic. The Mandalorians, always looking for a good war, became involved. Various planetary governments made difficult choices about which side to support or whether to try to stay neutral. The Jedi mobilized fully against a Sith threat for the first time since the Great Hyperspace War, and the fighting was intense and costly. One of the most devastating moments of the war came from a source that should have been an ally. Exar Kun corrupted a significant number of Jedi, turning them to the dark side and using them against their former brothers and sisters. The psychological impact of this on the Jedi Order was enormous. Knowing that your fellow Jedi might have been turned, that the person you trained with and trusted might now be your enemy, created a kind of paranoia and grief within the Order that affected its ability to function effectively. The Great Hunt, as some Jedi pursued the turned Jedi, was as much an internal tragedy as an external military campaign. Jedi who had been friends found themselves on opposite sides. Masters who had taught students had to fight those students. The emotional dimension of this aspect of the war was one that the Jedi Code's prohibition on attachment was supposed to protect against. But the law suggests that even those Jedi who followed the code most rigorously found the experience of fighting turned brethren genuinely traumatic. Ulic Qel-Droma's fall was completed in one of the most dramatic incidents of the war. Having already gone deep into the dark side, he committed an act of violence against someone he had once deeply cared for that severed his emotional connection to the light side more completely than any philosophical argument could have. The law presents this as a moment of no return, not because the dark side is inherently inescapable, but because the psychological weight of what he had done made the return path unimaginable to him in that moment. He continued to serve the Brotherhood, not out of conviction but out of despair. The destruction of Ossus was one of the Exar Kun War's greatest catastrophes. Ossus was a major center of Jedi knowledge and culture, a world where the Order had accumulated enormous archives and where some of its most experienced masters lived and taught. The attack on Ossus that resulted in the world's devastation was motivated by the desire to destroy Jedi knowledge and resources, to hit the Order at one of its most significant locations. The attack succeeded in destroying Ossus and killing many Jedi, but it also triggered a backlash that helped seal the doom of Kun's Brotherhood. The final assault on Yavin 4, where Exar Kun had established his primary base in the ancient Sith temples that Naga Sado's Massassi had built, was a combined Jedi and Republic military operation. The scale of the assault reflects how seriously the Republic had come to take Kun as a threat. Entire fleets gathered. Thousands of Jedi participated, The fighting on and around Yavin 4 was intense and prolonged. Kun himself proved extraordinarily difficult to defeat, because his mastery of the dark side had reached a level that could challenge even large numbers of Jedi simultaneously. The resolution of the conflict with Exar Kun required a solution that the lore presents as morally complex, even in its successful outcome. The Jedi who gathered on Yavin 4 combined their force power in a massive assault that was designed not to kill Kun in a conventional sense, but to trap his spirit, to bind him to the planet in a state of force imprisonment that prevented him from acting in the physical world. The cost of this solution was the life force of every living thing on Yavin 4, which was drained to power the ritual. The Massassi who had served Kun were killed in the process. Ulic Quell Droma's fate was different, and in some ways more poignant. He was severed from the Force by a Jedi who had enough power to perform that extraordinary act. Cut off from the Force, Kel Droma lost the thing that had defined him his entire life. The lore presents the severing not as an execution, but as a different kind of ending, one that left him alive, but transformed. He spent his remaining years in isolation, eventually helping one person find a measure of peace before his own death. The lore suggests his ending was not without redemption, though the scale of what he had done made that redemption deeply complicated. The aftermath of the Exar Kun War left the Jedi Order and the Republic battered. Ossus was gone. Hundreds of Jedi knowledge had been destroyed. The Order would need generations to fully recover, and the Brotherhood of Darkness, though broken in its organized form, had demonstrated once again that the Sith tradition was not something that could be permanently eliminated through military defeat alone. As long as the knowledge survived, as long as individuals were drawn to the power the dark side offered, the Sith would be able to reconstitute themselves. The political consequences of the war included significant debate in the Republic Senate about the Jedi's role. Some senators argued that the Jedi's presence had made the Republic a target, that the Sith seemed specifically interested in fighting the Jedi rather than in conquering the Republic for conventional political reasons, and that the Republic would be better off with a more arm's-length relationship with the Order. These arguments were in the minority and were ultimately unsuccessful, but their existence reflects a genuine political tension about what the Jedi's association with the Republic cost as well as what it provided. The Jedi Council undertook a comprehensive review of its training protocols after the war. The number of Jedi who had fallen to the dark side during the conflict was disturbing in itself, but the manner of many of those falls was particularly troubling. In many cases, the fallen Jedi had shown warning signs that had been noted but not acted on decisively enough. The Council debated whether stricter intervention protocols were needed, whether certain students should be removed from training earlier, and whether the process of advancement through the Jedi ranks should be more rigorous. The concept of the Jedi Covenant emerged in the post-war period, a secretive group within the Jedi Order that was dedicated to preventing another Sith resurgence by any means necessary. The Covenant operated with more willingness to take preemptive action than the broader order was comfortable with, and its existence was a sign of how seriously the war's aftermath was taken. The Covenant would have its own complicated history, including the commission of acts that the Jedi would have condemned in an open context. The lore presents the Covenant as a well-intentioned but ultimately problematic institution, one whose secrecy and certainty about its own righteousness led it to make decisions that were genuinely wrong. The Mandalorians who had fought in the war reconsidered their relationship to the conflicts of the Republic era in its aftermath. The war had been a significant engagement for many clans, and the outcome, the Republic's victory, was not one that diminished the Mandalorian warrior tradition in their own eyes. What it told certain Mandalorian leaders, particularly the one who was building toward what would become Mandalore the Ultimate, was that a sufficiently well-organized Mandalorian force could be more than a mercenary element in someone else's war. It could be the central force in a conflict of its own making. The Mandalorian wars were still in the future, but the ambition that would produce them was crystallizing. Technology development in the Republic was increasingly driven by the military lessons of the wars. Starship designers incorporated the tactical lessons of engagements with Sith forces. Republic scientists studied Sith artifacts that had been captured at considerable risk, attempting to understand the principles behind them and potentially develop countermeasures. The study of the dark side artifacts was controversial within the Jedi Order, for reasons that should be familiar by now, but it was happening regardless of that controversy. Force research within the Jedi Order was cautiously expanding in some areas while remaining restricted in others. The experience of the wars had produced Jedi with unusual abilities, techniques developed under the extreme pressure of combat with Sith opponents that were not part of the standard curriculum. These innovations were sometimes absorbed into the Order's training system and sometimes kept as the personal techniques of individual Jedi who had developed them. The formalization of the 7 lightsaber combat forms was a product of this period, a systematic attempt to preserve and transmit the fighting knowledge that the wars had developed. The Dark Jedi and fallen Padawans of the Exar Kun era, who had survived the war, scattered across the galaxy in its aftermath. Some were hunted down and killed by Jedi, some were captured and imprisoned. Some escaped into the Outer Rim or into regions of space where the Republic's authority was limited. A small number eventually found their way back to the light, a process that the law treats as possible, but rare and difficult. The fate of these individuals is part of the unwritten history of the era, the choices made by people who are not famous enough to be in the historical record. The Republic's expansion paused during the post-war reconstruction period. Taking on new member worlds required resources and administrative capacity that the Republic needed to redirect toward rebuilding what the war had damaged. The Outer Rim remained as complicated and undergoverned as ever. The criminal networks that operated in the gaps of Republic authority continued to function, and in some cases expanded during the war's disruption of normal commerce. The galaxy did not stop being complex because the Republic needed simplicity. The end of the Exar Kun era marks a moment of deep institutional fatigue for both the Republic and the Jedi. The Order has fought 2 major Sith conflicts within a span of roughly 2,000 years, each of which cost it dearly. The Republic has survived both conflicts, but survival has come at a price. The Senate is debating military preparedness, the role of the Jedi, and the question of how a civilization maintains its values when the threats it faces seem to demand that it compromise them. These are not questions that have easy answers in the law or in real life, and the Republic's attempts to answer them over the coming centuries would produce both wisdom and catastrophic mistakes. Chapter 5: The Mandalorian Wars. The Mandalorian Wars did not begin with a formal declaration. They began, as many of the most significant conflicts in Old Republic history began, with something that looked like it might be contained and turned out not to be. Mandalorian clans had been raiding Outer Rim worlds for several years before the full scale of what was happening became apparent to the Republic. By the time the Senate acknowledged that this was not ordinary Mandalorian raiding, but a systematic campaign of conquest, the Mandalorians had already taken significant territory and were pressing deeper into Republic space. Mandalore the Ultimate was the figure who had organized the clans and given the Mandalorian warrior culture a new direction and ambition. The lore suggests that Mandalore the Ultimate was a leader of extraordinary charisma and tactical ability, someone who had looked at the fragmented Mandalorian Confederation and seen the potential for something much larger and more organized. He had spent years preparing, recruiting, training, and equipping Mandalorian forces for a campaign that would test the Republic in ways it had not been tested since the Exar Kun War. The Mandalorian philosophy of war was fundamentally different from the Sith philosophy. The Sith wanted power for its own sake. The Mandalorians wanted what their culture called proof of strength, the validation of combat against worthy opponents. This does not mean the Mandalorian Wars were less destructive than the Sith Wars. The Mandalorians killed enormous numbers of people during their campaign, destroyed cities, enslaved populations, and committed what by any reasonable standard were atrocities. But the motivation was different, and that difference mattered for how the conflict played out. The Republic Senate's response to the early Mandalorian raids was inadequate. The Senate debated the appropriate level of military response, while the Mandalorians continued to advance. Some senators argued for restraint, fearing that a large military mobilization would be expensive, would require constitutional compromises, and might not be necessary if the Mandalorians could be deterred or contained through limited action. Other senators argued for immediate and overwhelming force. The debate went on longer than it should have, while Outer Rim worlds burned. The Jedi Council's position was one of non-intervention, and this decision is one of the most debated choices in Old Republic history. The Council argued that the Force did not clearly show that the Jedi should involve themselves in what it characterized as a political and military conflict, rather than a Force-related threat. This argument was greeted with bewilderment and fury by Jedi who saw millions of people being killed and believed that sitting on the sidelines was a moral failure of the First Order, whatever the Council's Force visions might suggest. Among those who disagreed most forcefully with the Council's decision was a Jedi Knight named Revan. Revan was already one of the most talented Jedi of his generation, possessed of a combination of Force sensitivity, tactical brilliance, and personal charisma that made him a natural leader. He was also, importantly, someone who had studied Sith teachings in the archives more deeply than the Council was entirely comfortable with. His response to the Council's non-intervention policy was to ignore it. Revan and his friend and companion Malak gathered a group of Jedi who agreed with them that the Mandalorian Wars required Jedi involvement. They presented themselves to the Republic military not as representatives of the Jedi Order, but as individual Jedi who were exercising their own judgment, and they offered their services. The Republic military, desperate for effective leadership, accepted. Revan was eventually given command of Republic forces in the conflict, and the war's character changed dramatically under his leadership. The Jedi Crusaders, as Revan's faction came to be called, were a significant military asset, but also represented a rupture within the Jedi Order that would have lasting consequences. The Council's authority had been defied, publicly and successfully. The Jedi who followed Revan were demonstrating that individual Jedi could decide for themselves when the Council's guidance was wrong and act accordingly. This precedent was uncomfortable for an institution that depended on hierarchy and discipline. The Council's failure to prevent the defection or to draw the defecting Jedi back was a sign of its limited actual authority over strong-willed members who had decided to chart their own course. Revan's military genius was apparent from the beginning of his involvement in the war. He understood the Mandalorian way of fighting, in ways that previous Republic commanders had not, and he understood how to use the peculiarities of that way of fighting against them. The Mandalorians valued direct combat, valued proving themselves in pitched battle. Revan was willing to give them pitched battles, but on terrain and under conditions that he had selected to minimize Mandalorian advantages and maximize Republic ones. He was also willing to use tactics that more cautious commanders had avoided, including some that the Jedi Code was not entirely comfortable with. The lore suggests that Revan's campaign in the Mandalorian Wars involved decisions that were not fully sanctioned by the Republic government or the Jedi Council, decisions that resulted in significant civilian casualties or that used methods that were ruthless by Republic standards. The destruction of the planet Malachor V, which Revan ordered as the culminating blow of the war, is the most dramatic example. The weapon that was detonated at Malachor V, sometimes called the mass shadow generator, used gravitational forces to tear the planet and everything on it apart. The Mandalorian force there was destroyed. So was a significant Republic force that had not been evacuated. So was effectively the entire population of the world. The atrocity at Malachor V won the war. The Mandalorian fleet that survived the engagement surrendered. Mandalore the Ultimate was dead. The organized military power that had been threatening the Republic was broken. But the cost of winning in this way was enormous, not just in the immediate casualties, but in what it did to the people who had participated and survived. The Republic forces who witnessed or participated in what happened at Malachor V were deeply traumatized. Many of the Jedi who survived it were changed in ways that they would spend years trying to understand. The aftermath of Malachor V saw Revan and Malak disappear into the unknown regions, rather than returning to the Republic in triumph. This decision, which puzzled and troubled the Republic and the Jedi alike, was not random. Revan had found evidence during the Mandalorian Wars of a threat beyond the Mandalorian campaign, had been serving as a prelude to something that was waiting in the unknown regions, and that Revan believed had to be dealt with before it could move against the Republic. The lore points toward the true Sith Empire, the continuation of the ancient Sith civilization that had retreated into hiding after the Great Hyperspace War. As the thing Revan was investigating, what Revan found when he went into the unknown regions, what happened to him there, and what it did to him is one of the most significant and tragic stories in the Old Republic lore. He found the Sith Emperor, had been alive since before the Great Hyperspace War, sustained by dark side rituals that effectively gave him functional immortality. He was one of the most powerful Force users who had ever lived, and he had been quietly rebuilding the Sith Empire in the unknown regions for 2,000 years, waiting for the moment when he could strike against the Republic with overwhelming force. The Sith Emperor did to Revan what he was extraordinarily good at doing to powerful Force users. He broke him through torture, through sustained dark side influence, through techniques that the lore describes as a kind of mental and spiritual dissolution. The Emperor transformed Revan from the Republic's greatest champion into a tool of the Sith. Malak was subjected to the same process. The two Jedi who had defied the Council and won the Mandalorian Wars emerged from the unknown regions as Darth Revan and Darth Malak, Sith Lords, with access to all the military and strategic knowledge they had developed in the service of the Republic, now directed against it. The Jedi Civil War that followed is one of the most devastating conflicts in the Old Republic timeline. Revan, using Sith military forces that had been gathering in the unknown regions, and Republic military forces he had either corrupted or convinced to defect, launched a war against the Republic that very nearly succeeded where the Great Hyperspace War and the Exar Kun War had failed. The Sith fleet under Revan's command was disciplined, strategically sophisticated, and technically advanced in ways that reflected both Revan's own genius and the resources of the hidden Sith Empire. The Jedi were divided in their response. Many had followed Revan into the Mandalorian Wars, and were now following him again, this time into the Sith. Others fought against him with the Republic. The Jedi Order was being torn apart for the third time, and this time, the tearing was particularly severe because the leader of the Sith forces was someone who had been, until recently, one of the Jedi's greatest champions. The capture of Revan by a Jedi strike team, including the young Jedi Bastila Shan, was the turning point of the war. Malak, who had been serving as Revan's apprentice, betrayed his master during the battle aboard Revan's flagship, using the opportunity to attempt to kill Revan and seize control of the Sith forces for himself. Bastila's Force technique of battle meditation, which she was uniquely skilled at, allowed her to stabilize the dying Revan and bring him back to a form of life. The Jedi Council, seeing the opportunity, made a decision that was either extraordinarily wise or extraordinarily reckless, depending on how you read the lore. They wiped Revan's memory. They constructed a new identity for him, gave him false memories, and reintroduced him to the Republic and the Jedi as an amnesiac soldier. Their reasoning was that Revan's skills and Force sensitivity might be needed to end the war, that the Starforge and the Sith military threat required someone of Revan's ability to defeat, and that a Revan who remembered being Darth Revan might not cooperate. A Revan who thought he was someone else might do exactly what they needed him to do. The ethics of this decision are not something the lore presents as simple. The Council wiped the memory of a sentient being without that being's consent. They remade his identity. They used him as a tool. Even if the outcome justified the means from a purely consequentialist standpoint, the means involved were a violation of the individual that would be difficult to defend under any philosophical framework the Jedi were supposed to hold. The council members who made this decision knew it was complicated and made it anyway, which says something about the pragmatic compromise of principle that can happen even in well-intentioned institutions under extreme pressure. The reborn Revan, working with Bastila Shan and a group of companions, traced the path that led to the Starforge and ultimately to the defeat of Malak and the destruction of the Starforge. The recovery of Revan's memories during this journey, a gradual process triggered by encounters with places and people he had known before, was one of the most personally dramatic aspects of the story. He had to confront who he had been, what he had done, and what the choices he had made actually meant without the armor of a constructed identity to protect him. The defeat of Malak and the destruction of the Starforge did not end the Jedi Civil War's consequences. The Sith forces that had been serving Revan and Malak did not simply disappear. Many of them continued fighting under various commanders. The Republic was in a severely weakened state. The Jedi Order had lost enormous numbers of members to death or to the Sith. The galaxy was in a state of exhaustion and instability that would take years to even begin to address. And there were other Sith survivors who saw the chaos as an opportunity. Among them were the Sith Triumvirate, three dark side figures who had operated in the shadows during the Jedi Civil War, and who moved to consolidate what remained of the Sith network in the aftermath of Malak's death. But that story, the story of Darth Traya and her companions, and of the near destruction of the Jedi Order, belongs to the next chapter. Chapter 6. The Jedi Purge and the Age of Traya. The wound that the Jedi Civil War left in the Force was not metaphorical, or at least the lore suggests it was not. The deaths of so many Force-sensitive individuals, the trauma of the Malachor V catastrophe, the sustained dark side power that Revan and then Malak had channeled through the Starforge, all of this had effects on the Force itself that were felt by those sensitive enough to detect them. The galaxy, in the immediate aftermath of the Jedi Civil War, had a quality that the surviving Jedi described as a kind of deadness, a muting of the living Force that was deeply disturbing to those who had known the Force at its fuller expression. Into this wounded galaxy stepped three figures who had been operating in the background of the Jedi Civil War and who now moved to the foreground. Darth Nihilus, Darth Sion, and Darth Traya formed the Sith Triumvirate, and each of them represented a different aspect of what the dark side could do to, or with, a Force-sensitive individual. Nihilus was defined by hunger, a void in the Force that consumed life and light. Sion was defined by pain, held together by suffering and hatred into a body that should have been dead but refused to cease functioning. Traya was defined by something more complicated, a profound disillusionment with both the Jedi and the Sith, a nihilistic philosophy that questioned whether the Force itself was not ultimately a wound in the universe. Traya's backstory is among the most complex in the Old Republic lore. She had been a Jedi Master, specifically the Master of the young Revan before his defection to the Mandalorian Wars. She had been expelled from the Jedi Order for teaching Revan things the Council considered dangerous. She had then attached herself to the Sith, become Darth Traya, trained Nihilus and Sion, and then been betrayed by them on Malachor V, left to survive on that devastated world. She had developed a philosophy that rejected the binary of light and dark side, and concluded that the Force itself was a kind of manipulation, a sentient or semi-sentient power that used beings as its instruments and discarded them when their usefulness was over. The Jedi Purge that the Triumvirate carried out was systematic and effective in ways that earlier anti-Jedi campaigns had not been. Nihilus, in particular, was devastating, a being who could drain entire planets of their Force energy, killing every living thing on them. Worlds that had strong Force presences were targeted specifically. Jedi Masters who had survived the Civil War were hunted down. The Jedi archives and training facilities were attacked. The Triumvirate's goal was not to defeat the Jedi in battle. It was to eliminate the Jedi Order as an institution, to kill or drive away every Jedi until the Order no longer existed as a functional entity. They came very close to succeeding. The lore suggests that at the height of the Purge, there were perhaps a handful of Jedi Masters left in the entire galaxy, scattered and in hiding. The Jedi Council had essentially ceased to exist. The training academies were empty. The cultural and institutional memory of the Order was under existential threat. It is difficult to overstate how close the Triumvirate came to achieving something that the Sith had tried to do for thousands of years and had never previously managed: the actual elimination of the Jedi Order. The Exile, the figure who is the protagonist of the second Knights of the Old Republic game, is one of the most interesting individuals in the Old Republic lore, for reasons that go beyond her role in the triumvirate conflict. She was a Jedi general who had been at Malachor V, who had survived the mass shadow generator's activation, and who had survived it in a way that left her changed in the Force. She had severed her connection to the Force, or it had been severed for her by the trauma of what she witnessed and participated in. She was a wound in the Force, in a different way than Nihilus, not a consuming void, but a cut, a severed connection that should not have been survivable, and yet was. The exile's journey brought her back into contact with the remnants of the Jedi Order, and eventually into direct conflict with the Triumvirate. Her relationship with Kreia, the woman who had been Darth Traya and who was serving as her companion and teacher, is one of the most philosophically dense relationships in Star Wars lore. Kreia was using the exile for her own purposes, while also, genuinely, caring about the exile as an individual. The manipulation and the genuine relationship existed simultaneously, and sorting out where one ended and the other began is not something the lore makes easy. The defeat of Darth Nihilus at Telos was one of the most significant moments of the era. Nihilus was an entity that could drain the Force from anyone who used the Force against him, which made conventional Force combat against him essentially impossible. The strategy that defeated him exploited the nature of the wound the exile carried. Her severed Force connection meant she did not have Force energy in the conventional sense, for Nihilus to drain, which gave her the ability to engage him without immediately becoming his victim. The battle was not simply a physical confrontation, but a contest of existential conditions, two anomalies in the Force colliding. Darth Sion's defeat was more personal and more prolonged. Sion could not die in any conventional sense, because his will to continue, his hatred and pain, literally held his shattered body together. The way to defeat him was not to break his body, which would not stay broken, but to break his will. The exile eventually managed this through repeated confrontation and through the specific relationship they had, which touched on questions of connection and isolation that were personal to Sion in ways that physical combat could not address. When Sion finally let go of his hatred and chose to die, it was the most voluntary decision he had made in years. Darth Traya's defeat at Malachor V, where she had retreated, was the culmination of the story and also the most philosophically complex of the three confrontations. Traya's argument that the Force was a predatory force that used sentient beings as its instruments, and that the proper response to this was to cut the Force from the galaxy entirely, was not dismissible as simple madness. It was a coherent, if extreme, position that the exile had to engage with, rather than simply reject. The fight between them was also a conversation, and the lore suggests that the conversation mattered as much as the combat. The aftermath of the Triumvirate's defeat left the Jedi Order in a condition that was, in some ways, even more precarious than the height of the Purge. At least during the Purge, there was an enemy to fight, a crisis that forced surviving Jedi to be active and resourceful. In the aftermath, there was just the empty reality of how few Jedi were left. Rebuilding the Order, from this point, required decisions about what the Order should be going forward, that not all surviving Jedi agreed on. The exile made a choice at the end of her story that the lore handles somewhat obliquely. She followed Revan into the unknown regions, into the territory where the true Sith Empire was waiting. The lore suggests this decision was motivated by both personal loyalty and by a genuine assessment that the threat of the true Sith Empire was the most significant long-term danger the galaxy faced, and that it needed to be addressed rather than allowed to grow while the Republic recovered from the immediate crises. The Republic, in the aftermath of the Triumvirate conflict, was in a state of significant political dysfunction. The wars and the Purge had created refugee crises, economic disruption, and a collapse of public confidence in the Republic's ability to protect its citizens. The Senate was paralyzed by factional disputes. The military had been stretched beyond its capacity. Various systems were considering breaking away. The Republic's survival as an institution during this period required a combination of good fortune and the efforts of individuals who simply refused to let it fail. The Mandalorian culture was undergoing its own transformation in the aftermath of the Mandalorian Wars. Mandalore the Ultimate's defeat and death had left a leadership vacuum that was filled by a figure called the Mandalore the Preserver, who had fought against the original Mandalorians rather than with them, and who was working to rebuild Mandalorian culture, along lines that were somewhat different from the pure war worship that had produced the wars. The Mandalorians were not becoming peaceful, but the specific ambition to conquer the Republic was being set aside in favor of a more complex relationship with the galaxy. The Outer Rim worlds, that had borne the brunt of both the Mandalorian Wars and the Sith conflicts, were the slowest to recover. The core worlds had the resources and infrastructure to rebuild relatively quickly. The Outer Rim had neither. Worlds that had been economically marginal before the wars found themselves in genuine humanitarian crisis afterward. The Republic Senate debated aid packages and reconstruction programs with the usual combination of genuine concern and political calculation. And the Outer Rim's recovery was slower and less complete than the core world's recovery. The dark side presence on multiple worlds, left over from Sith activity during the wars, was a persistent problem. Jedi were periodically sent to investigate worlds where dark side energy was affecting the local population, or where Sith artifacts were being discovered. These missions were carried out with a Jedi Order that was, to put it bluntly, barely functional. The Council was a shadow of its former self. The number of Jedi available for deployment was a tiny fraction of what it had been before the Jedi Civil War. The Order was managing to keep its essential functions going through the efforts of individuals who were working at the limits of what was sustainable. Force ghosts, echoes of the dead in the Force, were particularly active during this period. The sheer number of powerful Force users who had died violently during the previous century of conflict had left the Force unusually full of echoes. Jedi, who were sensitive to this aspect of the Force, reported hearing or sensing things that they could not always identify. On Malachor V, the wound in the Force was severe enough that the echoes were almost deafeningly loud to anyone who attempted to use the Force there. The planet itself had become a place of extraordinary dark side power, dangerous to visit and difficult to leave unchanged. The gradual reconstruction of the Jedi Order over the following decades was a slow and imperfect process. New students were found and trained. New masters were elevated from those who had survived and recovered from the Purge. A new council was eventually convened, but the order that emerged from this reconstruction was different from the one that had existed before the Jedi Civil War. It had been reduced, chastened, and in certain ways fundamentally altered by the experience of near extinction. The philosophical debates within the rebuilt order were shaped by what had happened. The falls of Revan, Malak, and so many others raised questions about Jedi training and philosophy that the survivors could not avoid. Was the attachment prohibition actually working? Were the restrictions on Force study creating Jedi who were more vulnerable to the dark side, not less, because they reached the dark side through ignorance rather than through understanding? Were the standards for Jedi training too high, leaving too many Force-sensitive individuals without proper guidance? Were they too low, admitting students who should not be admitted? The answers the rebuilt order arrived at were largely the same answers the pre-war order had held. The attachment prohibition was maintained. The restrictions on dark side study were maintained. The training protocols were adjusted in details, but not in fundamental philosophy. Whether this was wisdom, the discovery that the original approach had been correct all along, or institutional inertia, the inability to truly reimagine the order in ways that might have prevented future falls, is something the lore leaves genuinely ambiguous. The galaxy at the end of this chapter is exhausted. It has been through a generation of almost continuous violent conflict. The Republic survives, but is weakened. The Jedi Order survives, but barely. The Sith have been defeated in their organized forms, but the true Sith Empire is still out there in the unknown regions, building its strength under the Sith Emperor, who has been planning this revenge for millennia. The next chapter of Old Republic history will involve a pause, a period of relative stability, during which the Republic recovers, and the Sith plan, and then the most devastating war the galaxy has yet seen. Chapter 7: The Great Galactic War and the Return of the Sith Empire. The peace did not last forever. It never does. What happened 300 years after the events of the Jedi Civil War era was something the Republic and the Jedi had been warned about, had in some ways been preparing for, and were still not fully ready to face when it came. The true Sith Empire, the one that had been building in the unknown regions since the Great Hyperspace War, revealed itself with an act of such overwhelming violence that it changed the galactic balance of power almost overnight. The sacking of Coruscant was not the beginning of the Great Galactic War. The Sith Empire had been fighting the Republic for decades before the sacking, pressing into Republic territory through multiple corridors, using the lessons of the Great Hyperspace War and 2,000 years of preparation to execute a campaign that was both militarily sophisticated and strategically patient. But the sacking was the defining moment, the event that established the Sith Empire's return as an existential reality, rather than a distant threat. The Sith Emperor who commanded this return was not the same individual, in any meaningful sense, who had been defeated or scattered in the Great Hyperspace War. He was the same being in the literal sense of continuous physical identity, sustained by dark side rituals across millennia. But he had been changed by those millennia of isolation and planning, by the experience of watching the Sith Empire he had built be destroyed, by the long patience of preparation for a revenge that had to be executed perfectly. The Emperor's goals were also, the lore suggests, more complex than simple galactic conquest. He was pursuing something that his Sith subordinates did not fully understand, a goal that went beyond political dominance. The Jedi were the first to fight the Sith Empire's advance, as they always were, and the Jedi of this era were a recovered order, not the near-extinct institution of Krea's time, but a rebuilt and repopulated body that had spent 3 centuries returning to something like its former strength. The Jedi who fought the early stages of the Great Galactic War were capable, trained, and experienced. They were also outnumbered, facing a Sith military that had been built specifically to defeat them. The early battles of the Great Galactic War went against the Republic in most theaters. The Sith advance was coordinated, hitting multiple systems simultaneously in ways that prevented the Republic from concentrating its forces effectively. Jedi attempted to stop Sith Lord advances at multiple points and suffered heavy casualties. The Republic Navy fought hard and lost significant engagements. Planets fell, populations were enslaved or killed. The Republic's outer rim was carved up and taken by Sith forces with a speed that was demoralizing. The planet Alderaan became a significant battlefield of the war and an important site for a subsequent treaty. The fighting on Alderaan was prolonged and brutal, with Republic and Sith forces engaging in a sustained campaign across the planet's beautiful and contested terrain. The lore presents the Alderaan campaign as representative of the war's character, tactically complex, enormously costly in lives, and ultimately inconclusive because neither side could achieve a decisive victory in this particular theatre. The sacking of Coruscant occurred during what appeared to be peace negotiations. A Sith delegation had come to Alderaan to discuss a treaty, giving the appearance of a negotiated end to the war, while a separate Sith force used the distraction of the negotiations to execute a surprise attack on Coruscant itself. The Jedi Temple was attacked and partially destroyed. Sith forces occupied the capital. The Republic government was forced to sign the Treaty of Coruscant under duress, accepting terms that were humiliating and strategically damaging. The Treaty of Coruscant established a Cold War between the Republic and the Sith Empire that was never truly a peace. Territory that the Sith had taken was formally recognized as theirs. The Republic's military was constrained. The Jedi were blamed by large segments of the Republic population for failing to prevent the sacking, which was unfair in the sense that the Jedi had not failed to fight, but was understandable in the sense that the Jedi had been the Republic's primary force-based defense, and the capital had still been sacked. The period of Cold War between the Republic and the Sith Empire was characterized by proxy conflicts, espionage, political maneuvering, and occasional open military engagements that both sides tried to keep limited enough that they did not trigger a full resumption of the war. Both sides were rebuilding their military capabilities. Both sides were positioning themselves for what most observers on both sides privately assumed was coming. The treaty was a pause, not an ending. The Jedi Order during the Cold War operated under constraints that were new and uncomfortable. The peace treaty, placed limitations on Jedi activity in certain areas. The Republic Senate, sensitive to the political costs of being seen as too aggressive, sometimes restrained Jedi from taking actions that the Jedi believed were necessary. The relationship between the Order and the Senate became more strained during this period, as the Senate's political calculations occasionally conflicted with the Jedi's assessments of what the Force required. Within the Sith Empire, during the Cold War, the politics were as brutal as they always were. The Sith hierarchy functioned through a combination of formal rank and the constant power struggles that Sith philosophy encouraged. Dark Council members, the most powerful Sith lords below the Emperor himself, competed with each other for influence and resources, while also managing the permanent tension between their ambitions and the Emperor's absolute authority. The Sith military, the Imperial military, served the Empire as a whole and was generally more organized and disciplined than the internecine Sith politics might suggest. The Imperial Guard, the Emperor's personal protectors, occupied a unique position in Sith society. They were not Sith themselves in most cases, but were deeply skilled warriors and fanatics who had been trained from childhood for nothing but service to the Emperor. The Emperor's relationship to his own subjects was complex. He used them, needed them, and would sacrifice them without hesitation when his purposes required it. The law suggests that what the Emperor actually valued was not the Sith Empire as such, but as a means to an end that his subordinates only partially understood. The conflict over Makeb, the struggle for various Outer Rim worlds, the operations on Bel Savis, where an ancient Rakata prison had been maintained and was now being contested. These were the battlegrounds of the Cold War era, and they each told a particular story about what the Republic-Empire confrontation looked like in its operational details. The Bel Savis situation was particularly interesting because the Rakata connection meant that entities and technologies from the Infinite Empire era were being encountered and had to be managed by both sides, which brought the ancient history of the galaxy back into current political relevance. The individual actors of the Cold War era are too numerous to fully detail, but several stand out. The Jedi who operated during this period navigated an environment of moral complexity that was in some ways more demanding than outright war. In a war, you knew who the enemy was. In the Cold War, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere, embedded in political processes, conducting operations under cover of legitimacy, and capable of redefining any confrontation as a violation of the treaty, by whichever side it was convenient to blame. Jedi who were too aggressive faced political blowback. Jedi who were too cautious let threats develop that later became crises. The smugglers, bounty hunters, and other independent operators who worked the space between the Republic and the Empire during the Cold War occupied a fascinating position in the law. The intelligence services of both governments relied on deniable assets, individuals who could be sent where official agents could not go, who could be disavowed if captured, and who were motivated by profit rather than ideology in ways that made them both useful and unreliable. The Outer Rim was full of people living this precarious existence, doing work that neither the Republic nor the Empire would officially acknowledge while being essential to both. The Mandalorians during the Cold War were doing what Mandalorians do, fighting. The question was who they were fighting for. The Sith Empire had a long-standing alliance with the Mandalorians that dated back to before the Great Galactic War. And during the Cold War, the Mandalorians served as mercenaries and allies of the Empire in various capacities. But Mandalorian loyalty was never absolute to anyone but the Mandalorian, the leader of the Mandalorian clans, and what the Mandalore of any given period thought about the Empire shaped how deeply the alliance ran. Nar Shaddaa, the Hutt Moon, was one of the most important locations in the Cold War galaxy, for reasons that had nothing to do with formal politics. It was a center of the shadow economy, a place where information, weapons, people, and goods of all kinds moved through channels that neither the Republic nor the Empire officially sanctioned. The Hutts who controlled Nar Shaddaa did business with both sides, profiting from the conflict while carefully maintaining their independence. The law suggests that the Hutts had agents feeding intelligence to both governments simultaneously, which was a particularly Hutt approach to geopolitics. The Force artifacts and relics that both sides sought during the Cold War were another dimension of the conflict. Sith and Jedi alike recognized that the ancient artifacts of the Old Republic and earlier eras contained knowledge and power that could be decisive in the right hands. Expeditions to Kerriban, Dromund Kaas, Tython, and other historically significant worlds were conducted by both sides, sometimes openly and sometimes not. The recovery or denial of these artifacts was treated as strategically important, which says something about how both the Republic and the Empire thought about the relationship between history and power. Technology, during the Cold War, was at a level of sophistication that would be recognizable in the broad outlines to a viewer familiar with the technology of the prequel trilogy. Though several thousand years in the past, starfighters, capital ships, blasters, and lightsabers all existed in forms that were functionally similar to their later counterparts. This technological stability across such a vast span of time is one of the distinctive features of the Star Wars galaxy's history, a sign either of a civilization that had reached a plateau of development or one that was so focused on military applications that civilian technological progress was slower than it might otherwise have been. The end of the Cold War came, when the pressures that the treaty had been struggling to contain became too great. Incidents escalated. Both sides committed acts that the other side could point to as treaty violations. The political will to maintain the fiction of peace evaporated as leaders on both sides concluded that war was inevitable and that delaying it further only allowed the other side to prepare more thoroughly. The Great Galactic War resumed, this time with both sides more fully prepared and the stakes even higher than before. The resumed war brought changes in leadership on both sides. New Republic Supreme Chancellors made different strategic choices than their predecessors. New Sith Lords rose through the Dark Council hierarchy. The conflict's second phase was in some ways more tactically sophisticated than the first. With both sides having learned from the earlier fighting, it was also more destructive, because both sides were more prepared to absorb and inflict casualties at levels that would have caused earlier leaders to seek negotiation. The Emperor's true agenda became more apparent, though not fully clear, as the war progressed. He was pursuing something beyond military victory, some ritual or transformation that required a specific kind of galactic conflict, rather than simply a Sith conquest. The Dark Council members, who had the most insight into this agenda, were deeply alarmed by what they understood of it. The Emperor was not simply trying to win a war, he was trying to use the war to accomplish something that the law suggests would have been catastrophic, not just for the Republic, but for the Sith themselves. The Jedi Council, during the resumed war, was managing a level of operational demand that stretched its resources severely. Jedi were deployed across multiple theaters simultaneously, serving as commanders, individual operatives, and diplomatic assets in different contexts. The training pipeline was producing new knights as fast as it could, but the demand consistently outpaced the supply. The Order was making decisions about how to use limited Jedi resources that required accepting risks and accepting losses that in calmer times would have been considered unacceptable. The galaxy, at the height of the resumed Great Galactic War, was suffering in ways that rippled across every level of society. Economic disruption was severe. Trade routes were contested or shut down. Worlds that had been developing economically were diverted to war production or simply abandoned, as the conflict made them too dangerous. The non-combatant populations of worlds in contested space faced impossible choices about whether to flee or stay, and the resources available to them for either option were being consumed by the war. Chapter 8: The Fall, the Emperor's Endgame, and the Long Twilight. It is a convergence of several stories, each with their own logic and their own momentum, all running toward a point of catastrophic collision. The Emperor's Endgame was one story. The Republic's internal struggle to survive as a political entity was another. The Jedi Order's attempt to fulfill its purpose while being consumed by a conflict larger than any it had previously faced was a third. And running through all of them was the question of the Force itself, of what it meant for the galaxy that the light and dark sides were engaged in a conflict that had been building for tens of thousands of years. The Emperor's ritual, when its nature became fully apparent to those closest to him, was revealed as something that made the simple conquest of the Republic seem almost trivial by comparison. He intended to consume the force energy of every living being in the galaxy, not to rule them, not to enslave them, to literally consume them, to draw their life force into himself in a catastrophic ritual that would leave the galaxy dead and the Emperor powerful beyond any previous limit. The Sith Empire itself would be sacrificed to his ambition. He was, in the deepest possible sense, a being who had moved beyond political calculation into something that was more like cosmic predation. The opposition to the Emperor came from multiple directions. Within the Sith Empire, Dark Council members who understood enough of his plan to be alarmed by it began to work covertly against him. This was not because they had become sympathetic to the Republic or to Jedi values. It was because they did not want to die along with everyone else. Self-preservation is a powerful motivator, even in a culture built around power struggles. Sith, who had been killing each other for centuries, found themselves in the strange position of needing to coordinate against their own Emperor. The Jedi approach to the Emperor was more straightforward in principle, but more difficult in practice. The Emperor was one of the most powerful Force users who had ever lived. Confronting him directly was not something any individual Jedi or even small group of Jedi could accomplish without extraordinary preparation and circumstances. The Jedi Council debated and planned and argued about how to address the Emperor's threat in ways that reflected both the seriousness of the problem and the limitations of what the Council could actually accomplish. The hero of Tython, the Jedi Knight who serves as the protagonist of the Jedi Knight storyline in the KOTOR-era game lore, is the individual who most directly confronted the Emperor. The lore presents this confrontation as one of the most significant Force encounters in Old Republic history. The Jedi Knight managed to damage the Emperor's physical form and drove him from active control of the Sith Empire, which was a significant achievement. But it was not permanent. The Emperor's connection to the Force was too deep and too strange for simple defeat to constitute elimination. The Emperor's ability to use the Sith Emperor's voice to inhabit and speak through the bodies of other Force users was one of the mechanisms through which he continued to act, even after his physical defeat.